Well, just last week, we had a New Jersey cop caught on video when confronted by someone who believed that their First and Fourth Amendment rights were violated. He said, "I don't care about the Constitution. Obama doesn't care about the Constitution. He's not bound by it. Neither am I." We see this type of corruption in police departments all over the country now. And of course, in the past, we've had whistleblowers like Frank Serpico about the corruption based on the war on drugs. More recently in New York, we've had Adrian Schoolcraft, who blew the whistle and was testifying on the stop and search procedures of the New York Police Department. He was, for his trouble, he was picked up and arrested by the police there and put in an insane asylum until his father, a former police officer, was able to find him and get him out. That's an ongoing lawsuit going on there. Now, nowhere is this more of a problem, of course, than in Albuquerque. Albuquerque came to everyone's attention with the execution of the homeless man who was camping. And now we have an update to a story that we started covering back in February about the police chief, the entire police department of a small town taken down as this fellow was on his way to a Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association meeting, and a federal agent who threatened him that he would be fired, that his entire department would be taken out, and they were. Now, 6 months later, that officer is being charged with rape. He's been arrested, and of course, it was a staged event. Local news was told about it. They showed up. He was not given a chance to turn himself in, and there are many questions about this grand jury indictment. The primary witness against him was not there to testify, and the audio and video footage of the arrest in question was not allowed into evidence. So many times we see, especially in Albuquerque, where they have a major scandal about Taser, where the former police chief went to work for Taser, we see that even though they had one of the largest contracts for lapel cameras, they're rarely used in situations where there's questions about what happened. Now we have the opposite situation. We have a police officer who recorded the confrontation, wanting to enter that into evidence, not being allowed. So we wanted to talk to his attorney, who himself is a former police officer, who is now a civil rights attorney in Albuquerque, Tom Grover. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Grover. Now, as I was looking at this, I saw the KRQE news report. It looked to me like a clear case of character assassination, and some outright lies about the case that I had investigated, going back to when there was the altercation at the airport, the argument, and the threat that from the TSA agent or the federal agent that he would have Shane Harger fired, and subsequently that did happen. They say that that all came about when Shane Harger was trying to get past security screening with identification cards that had two different names. That's not true. I've seen the footage that was released. They cut out the footage of the actual altercation, but he went to the airport police and said, "I have two IDs here, and this is the reason I have two IDs." That's how it began. It wasn't like he was trying to slip something past them. So that raised questions right there. Do you want to address that?
Well, first of all, it's an entirely separate issue to the criminal charges that my client is facing right now. But going back to the January incident, I mean, the fact is that Mr. Harger, at his own initiative, approached security to present them and disclose to them that he had his actual identity, then an alias identity relating to a witness protection program that he had been involved in. And in alerting them to that fact, it became, this sort of aggravated situation where people started posturing, and it unfolded into, a much larger, more complicated mess. But that's entirely unrelated to the situation facing Mr. Harger right now.
I know. I just brought that up because it looked to me like a clear case of them trying to make him look like a dangerous and convicting him in the eye of public opinion. They showed up at his arrest, and that in and itself is unusual, isn't it? Typically, if there's a grand jury indictment, there's an arraignment date that is set up where they have a chance to turn themselves in. Instead, they went directly out with the cameras, with the local news station, and arrested him in front of the cameras.
Oh, there's no doubt that this was a staged event. I mean, as his attorney, I didn't even know law enforcement was on their way until after they had picked him up, and I received a phone call from one of the arresting officers. The fact that, media personnel and camera personnel from all three stations were present at the police station when they brought Mr. Harger in for transportation to the detention center is a clear concerted effort to have the media present, and they were alerted by government agencies. They certainly weren't alerted by myself or Mr. Harger. And it does nothing but sort of fan the flames of ridicule, and in many ways may be prejudicial to my client.
You talk about being prejudicial. In the article and in the video report, they say state police say Harger was taken into custody without any problems, as if they expected him to come out shooting or something. I mean, that's the kind of reporting that they did. They talked to a police officer, and even though they cover themselves legally by saying that this is an alleged crime, they use the term alleged, they have a quote from a police officer says, this just gives bad law enforcement a name when cops do this type of thing. So in other words, they're trying to convict him in the court of public opinion. And I guess I have a question also about the timing of this. They say that this began back in January. The investigation began back in January. To your knowledge, is that when it started?
That's my understanding. And much like Mr. Harger initiated disclosure to TSA back in January, when this allegation first came into the municipality that he's working with, he referred it. My understanding is that he referred it himself to state police for investigation. And we have to put this in context, which is the state of policing in New Mexico is under tremendous scrutiny because of DOJ's impending consent decree on the state's largest police department, that being the Albuquerque Police Department. So if you're an officer, if you're a law enforcement officer, whether you're a police officer or a sheriff's deputy in the state of New Mexico, if you're accused of some sort of wrongdoing, there's not going to be any degree of latitude of discretion given to you by any of the prosecuting authorities. They're simply not going to do it because of the mismanagement and the dire condition of policing in the state, because of so many things having happened and not being addressed. So that's the current climate of New Mexico policing.
Now, this incident happened back in January. When were the allegations made? Was that back in January? Did she make those allegations in January? Did she make them more recently?
I mean, let's particularize that a little bit. I mean, the alleged incident happened supposedly in January. Mr. Harger maintains his innocence, and under the eyes of the law, he's presumed to be innocent. So this alleged incident supposedly happened in January. That's correct.
And when did she come forth and say something about that? Did she do that at the time? Because it's my understanding from your statement to KRQE, you said that she was not present at the indictment, which was pretty unusual. So when did she make these allegations?
Weeks after the alleged incident is my understanding.
As a former law enforcement officer yourself, as someone who was a supervisor in the Albuquerque Police Department, how would you characterize, you talked about how there's now this current of suspicion about law enforcement in the area, and of course we've covered that many times, and we still see officers like the one who was in charge of the group that shot that homeless man. That kind of brought it into national attention. He's been subsequently promoted. I mean, what is your take on the environment there? You said that everybody's watching them very closely. What is your feeling about this?
Well, I think, after so many years where questionable police misconduct hasn't received any scrutiny, we're now in a phase of the state's history where anytime there's an allegation of misconduct by the police, it's going to be heavily scrutinized. Now, any law enforcement officer in the country will agree that the second you take somebody into custody, you're truly in care of that person. And when you take a person of the opposite sex in custody, there's procedures that you follow and that are taught in the academy to address that. So this is, this sort of notion of a person alleging some improper action by a police officer when they've been in their control and custody is something that's, distinctly aware for departments. And it's one thing when you're a large department and you have access to resources. It's another thing when you're a very small department and have very limited access to resources. So your exposure to these types of allegations increases as the size of your department decreases. And given the current state of things in New Mexico, given Mr. Harger's outspokenness in his particular county, it's sort of the making of a perfect storm where, unfortunately, things aligned up where now Mr. Harger is faced with these charges. I've been involved in 3 other incidences where officers had faced the same type of charges, total absence of any physical evidence and based, strictly on, what he said versus she said, or she said versus he said. And, this is something that the prosecution is going to have to overcome. There are issues. And unfortunately, in those cases, prosecutors are not going to use discretion and get rid of these cases. I mean, at least not in the cases that I've been involved in. They're going to take it to trial unless it's taken from them by, a judge, approving a motion to dismiss it or finding that there's, certain elements not existing. They're not going to do it because they're simply not going to put themselves in that sort of position of being that DA where they dismiss the case, especially not in this climate. So unfortunately, that's where Mr. Harker's in.
I understand. Now, you were talking about the difference in resources between small and large police departments. They just recently have had essentially a taser gate with the former police chief of the Albuquerque Police Department retiring and then going to work for Taser, and then Taser subsequently landing one of the biggest contracts they've ever had for, amongst other things, lapel cameras. And then we find subsequent to that that in many cases where that might be incriminating to the police, there's suddenly no recording of that. And we've talked about that in the past. Now, in this particular case, however, at the grand jury, one of the things that was surprising was the fact that the witness did not testify, but there's also, as I understand, existing audio and video recordings that might have some bearing on the case that might help Shane Harger and his innocence. Or
that's my understanding, and we have yet, despite our requesting, granted, yesterday was really the first day of business since the grand jury proceeding. We've yet to receive a recording from the grand jury to find out really where things are. I mean, you have to understand that we're in the very preliminary stages of this case. Our first order of business right now is getting Mr. Harger out of jail. He's clearly not a threat to the community. Otherwise, they wouldn't have taken the time that they did between the inception of these allegations and taking a grand jury. I mean, we're talking over 6 months. He's got, financial and personal attachments to the community. He's clearly not a threat, and there isn't any reason to keep him incarcerated under such, a strict measure of bond.
Yeah, they have they have very high bail, and it's a cash-only bail, as far as I understand.
Cash only. So our first order of business is really to get Mr. Harger out of prison and get him out of jail and get him with his family, and then we'll start forming together our plan to effect a very aggressive and very proper defense.
Well, we picked up on this case, and we learned about it from the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, from Sheriff Mack, and I've talked to Shane Harger in a couple of interviews, and I actually met him at the Bundy Ranch. He was there. He traveled at his own expense because, like us, he was concerned about the abuses of force in that area. To me, he didn't seem like a cocky, arrogant person who's seeking attention. He was a very straightforward, very sincere person. When I met him personally, I know that he stood down there with the farmers, with the ranchers, with the people on horseback. He stood there as they were threatening to shoot us. He believed that they would shoot because certainly as Albuquerque and New Mexico has a history, they don't make idle threats. When the police say that they're going to shoot you in New Mexico, they frequently do. Sometimes they shoot you without giving you a warning, evidently. But he stood there nevertheless because he was concerned about people's rights. So what can people do to help Shane Harger at this point?
There are two things that people can do. One, they can openly express their support and belief that he is innocent and that he is a good guy. And Shane is a person who I'd leave my kids with this evening if he were out. I don't have a problem with that. And then two, unfortunately, because he's the sole provider for his family, he's going to need as much financial support as he can because, as you can imagine, mounting a defense in the face of such charges is fairly expensive. So any support that he can receive financially will help to help offset. Unfortunately, the sad reality is that legal expenses are that they're expensive and they continue to climb, especially with more aggressive defense. So
is there some kind of a defense fund that's been set up for him?
My understanding is that their family members are in the process of putting that together right now.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll be on the lookout for that. Thank you so much for joining us. And as I said, I certainly don't believe that he's the type of person who would do this. He seemed to me to be a very sincere officer, exactly the opposite of what we see all too often, and that is officers who could care less about the Constitution, could care less about the rule of law. I think he's concerned for other people as he was for himself when he spoke back at the airport after multiple confrontations from the
I think that's a very accurate description of Mr. Harger. You know, he's a good guy, and like I said, we're going to defend this aggressively, because if it can happen to him, it can happen to anybody.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Tom Grover.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Well, I wanted to get some answers to some of those questions that were raised. Why didn't the alleged victim testify before the grand jury? Why weren't they shown the audio and video recordings? And why wasn't he given an arraignment date where he could turn himself in rather than stage a perp walk in front of all the networks? So I called the district attorney. That's Lemuel Martinez, the district attorney of the 13th District of New Mexico. He basically would not give me any information about what happened in the grand jury, saying that it was secret and closed. He wouldn't comment on anything, saying that the arraignment date and the amount of bail, the fact that it was an entirely cash bail, that was all set by the grand jury. Of course, we know that grand juries pretty much do what they're told. But if you want to follow this story, stay with us at InfoWars. We will be keeping abreast as to what's going on, not only with Shane Harger, but also with the many incidents in New Mexico and what's going on there with the police departments, with the rules of engagements there. If you're not a supporter of Prison Planet TV, please consider supporting our operation. It'll help you stay in touch with what's going on, developing news on a nightly basis, as well as access to all of Alex Jones's documentaries. 11 other people can share it with you simultaneously. That's 12 of you can be watching off of that one subscription, and there is a price break if you get an annual subscription. Well, that's it for tonight. Join us tomorrow at 11 Central, 8 p.m. Eastern.